Welcome to Olmsted Overheard, the place for real conversations about what is happening in and around Olmsted Falls, Ohio, and in this case, Olmsted Township. I'm your host, Mark McCausland. It has been about 2 weeks since my last episode where we laid out the basics of flock safety, what the technology is, how it works, and trade-offs that cities and townships and citizens should weigh when they consider it. Today is part 2, and like I promised, we are bringing it back to the local picture in Olmsted Township itself. My guest again is Nate French, an Olmsted Township resident who has spent months digging through public records to understand exactly how the township got to where it is today. This episode almost came out about a week ago. Nate and I had done one recording, and partway through my editing process, Nate reached back out to me to let me know that he had gotten a fresh batch of documents from some of his public records requests, and it added to the picture in enough ways that we wanted to include that information. So instead of me publishing what I had already edited, we scheduled another recording session, and I have now pulled all of that together here into this episode. So in our conversation, we will walk through the timeline of how Olmsted Township and Flock started their relationship back in 2021. We'll talk about a contract that got signed for $1 amount but was voted on for another one, and real questions about whether the person who signed it even had the authority to do so when they signed it. And we'll also share some details about how this technology shares data outside of Olmsted Township that I think residents should hear. Let's get into it. This is Olmsted Overheard. Nate, welcome back for part 2 of our flock discussion. How you doing today?
I'm doing well, Mark. Thanks for having me on again.
Thanks for being here. Why don't we jump right in, starting with a quick recap from episode 1. In the first part of our flock deep dive, we talked about what flock is, what the technology looks like, how it works, and how it's being used both from how Flock is marketing it, but also a little bit beyond of perhaps what they are marketing it to do. And we talked about some of the possible pro use cases, why Flock would be good. And we also talked about a number of examples of ways that it's been either misused or abused, or, it has security vulnerabilities and things of that nature.
In the previous episode, talked about how it's more than just a camera. It's a searchable national network that logs every movement that goes on in a given area. Like we said, it can be used for good at times in the best cases. And unfortunately, in a lot of cases, it's used for bad. So we're looking at the pros and cons and weighing if this should technology, be in our communities.
Yeah. And I think you also made a really good point towards the end of that episode, where, really kind of what's concerning you is that this is something that in Olmsted Township, it almost seemed like it was being implemented without really much opportunity for the citizens to weigh in. And I think that's a driving concern of yours, is you would like the community's voice to be able to be heard. You had mentioned you were disappointed that it got to the point that it's at, and the community has not really had a chance to give their voice. And that's going to be, I think, a big focus for today then, in this part, is to go through the history of Flock in the context of Olmsted Township. All right, well, let's go in. So we're going to take this with a timeline approach. So dating back, I believe, to 2021. And Nate, I will let you take it from there.
Yeah, and we're seeing a lot more of this in the news now, and seeing from city to city, state to state, a lot of these discussions popping up, and it's becoming more of a topic of conversation. But for our specific context in Olmsted Township, it started in 2021, in January of 2021. Back then, a Flock representative gave a presentation to our board.
The Board of Trustees, right?
The Board of Trustees, correct, yeah. And a follow-up email then went to the police chief. And at that time, when the board heard that pitch, they didn't take any action. So they didn't vote on anything. There was no contract. They didn't authorize anything. From there, the idea kind of sat with them for a couple of years. And what changed wasn't necessarily the board's opinion. It was Flock deciding on who they were going to pitch to next. So that's where things get a little bit interesting, because in 2023, instead of going back to the elected board, Flock went directly to the police department. So a Flock salesperson sent a series of emails directly to the police chief and the detective. The trustees were not copied on these emails, and their emails went unanswered from March to November of that year. The constant emails, basically weekly, from the sales rep trying to start that conversation up again and give them, a little bit more opportunity to, purchase. And the tone of the emails was also interesting because the Flock's own salesperson said, sorry to be a pest here. They don't ever seeing this isn't really a priority for you guys, but yet they kept pestering. And during that time, I think it was early on in that time, the police department did agree to a free trial of sorts. So this is a very common practice by Flock to allow a police department access to their system without needing actual hardware installed in the territory. It was a 90-day free trial, basically allowing them to use cameras in other cities and access to those networks without having to sign a contract or anything like that.
Basically to allow them to query the database. They're obviously, there's no cameras yet at this juncture in Olmsted Township, but they are giving the police department temporary, supposedly, access to the database to query other towns' networks.
Yes. Yeah, so they authorized this 90-day free access trial, and 2 years went by, and it was a 90-day trial with the memorandum of understanding with the police department, and 2 years went by where they continued to have this access, and they used the software and they used the system beyond what that MOU, as it's called, was outlined for. All while these emails are still coming from the sales department of Flock to the police department. You can see in these emails, the language kind of changes from, hey, how are you doing? Let's keep this conversation going. Once they kind of went unanswered and that 2-year mark hits, the tone shifts to, hey, if you want to keep this system and access to this system that we know you've been using into the new year, you're now going to have to purchase hardware. You're going to have to purchase cameras to put up in your jurisdiction. And that email went to the administrator, and the administrator then let the trustees know on September 9th of last year. He disclosed that they had been using this system well beyond their initial 90 days. And if they wanted to continue that access, they would have to now purchase hardware. So
just to clarify this, because people might not know, when you mention and reference the administrator, you're talking about the township administrator, which is a position within Olmsted Township. It is not an elected position. Is that correct? It's an appointed position, I would assume?
Yes, correct. Yeah. The Board of Trustees are our elected officials, and the administrator, I believe, yes, is appointed in some fashion. And so, yeah, we're, September of 2025 now. The message to the board is that essentially, if you want to have this access, we now have to buy in. The initial offer, what that was presented to them, was for 4 cameras for $12,500, and it was said at that point to be a realistic starting point. And I wanted to note that there's a deadline in these emails of September 26th. A lot of these first-year contracts with Flock will put in a bunch of discounts and waive installation fees, have reduced pricing. So I just want to, put a pin in this September 26th deadline for those reduction in fees. At that time, the board basically, I think one board member replied and said, yeah, I know it's a given that we have to continue this system. We've been using it, and we're essentially, we've built our practice on this system, so we should keep it kind of.
And you have that documented?
Yes. All right. So for context, this is the initial reference document email on 9/9 sent from Gary, our administrator. Last Friday, Detective Heathcote and Trustee Cole met with the representative regarding their license to the platform. For the past 2 years, despite originally being granted only a 90-day trial through the memorandum of understanding, they've been using it for that amount of time. To continue our access, the township must purchase at least 1 LPR unit. And then it was laid out here for the initial proposal was for 8 cameras. They have said, 4 cameras may be a little bit more realistic in that sense. So the adjusted total would be $12,500 per year. The response to that email was from Tom Cole, and he said, thanks for forwarding. I feel this is necessary tool for our police department. And from there, it went to, we do need these cameras. That's a given. I believe that 2 heads of the department need to be included in these discussions, as well as Brian, who's the fiscal officer, and Tracy. I'm not entirely sure what her position was at the time, so we can work away on where to pull this money. Yeah. And so from there, that deadline does come into play here. So September 9th, they've got until the 26th to sign a potential contract for these discounts to still be in play.
Okay.
A week later or so, I think it was 9 days later, on September 18th, the board did meet and they tabled the Flock proposal. 1 trustee was absent. So again, no authorization was given on behalf, or no vote was taken on behalf of this contract. And then from there, 7 days later, the administrator, Gary, signed the law enforcement agreement. And I will pull up the signed contract where the purchase order on that agreement read TBD. And we'll get a little bit more to like the implications and impact of what that means. But he did sign that agreement on the 25th. And then on October 2nd, 7 days later, the board, they met and voted on this particular topic and voted to pass it unanimously. So this is their actual law enforcement agreement, and it details the full breakdown line for line on what they're getting. So they have 7 ALPR cameras, so automated license plate reader cameras. Those are the ones that take the photos. And then 1 live feed camera. So live feed camera being slightly different. It's obviously a video feed instead of still photos that are being taken. Billing schedule, annual recurring, detailing the total cost of this contract being $24,500. Here are those discounts because this was signed on the 25th, 1 day before that deadline comes into play. We can see Gary's signature and the purchase order number. This is where the certified funds come into play. Purchase order of TBD, meaning no funds were certified at that time or attached to this contract, which plays a major role later on.
And also to point out, so in this document here, you can see that the dollar values were that 24,000 some odd amount versus in the email thread, they were seemingly moving towards the 12,000 amount. So this contract was for 24,500, signed prior to the October 2nd meeting of the trustees.
Yes.
And then here's the minutes for that. Okay, perfect. Walk me through this.
Yep. After each of the public hearing and trustee meetings, they send out meeting minutes essentially to discuss outline what was discussed at that meeting. And here we can see, here's all of the votes for new business. And we can see that line D, flock safety law enforcement agreement. We can see that the annual voted on amount was for that 12,500. And we can see that the board did unanimously approve this. And we can also see its amendments to the agenda for new business line D, that flock safety contract, changing from 24,500, the initial cost, to 12,500. So that plays a role because the contract for the original 24.5 was already signed, and they voted on a lower scope, which was obviously not contracted with flock. And for local context as well, about a month ago now, I think it was June 3rd, Gary had talked to the media and did announce that they're going forward with the 24,500 option for those 8 cameras. Again, outside of the scope that was voted on by the trustees.
How did it get to that point then? Where's the gap here? Again, just to recap, email thread with trustee members seemingly indicating they would be in favor of the 12,000 amount. Then Gary, the township administrator, signs a contract for 24,000 some odd dollars without mentioning an actual PO number. Then after that, in a township trustee meeting, the board votes on and approves the 12,000 amount, despite the contract being 24,000. And then what happens next?
So what happens next is the township is in communication with flock regarding their next steps, which would be permitting. And October 28th, a few weeks later, a lieutenant relayed to Gary, the administrator, that our police detective had been told by flock that all permits were approved and finalized. That was not the case because on February 27th of this year, 4 months later, the County Department of Public Works issued comments and saying 7 deficiencies, and they flagged that 2 of the camera locations, one being on Stearns Road and the other being on Columbia Road, did not appear to be located within Olmsted Township. So that tells me is that as of late February, these permits were not complete or finalized.
But again, the contract is still something that I'm confused about, because in the trustee meeting, they voted in favor of the 4 cameras, yet the contract that's being moved forward on is for 8 cameras.
Agreed. Yeah. So as we're going forward, there's permitting questions at stake, and then there's also the signature, the lack of the purchase order, and the certified funds, which is something I brought up at the May 20th public hearing. So at that meeting, I gave a public statement to the board and the public regarding kind of what we've touched on so far, along with some other anecdotes, and asked the board directly if they certified the funds for that signed contract. And the township law director, he went on the mic and did acknowledge that fiscal certification required by law was not obtained before that contract was signed. And his reasoning was, at that time, they didn't know how much the contract would cost. So certification of funds was going to take place and only needed to take place when they paid the bill. And that first part was interesting because, as you and I both saw, as we just kind of laid out, that contract clearly states all the line items, their amounts, and the contracted total
of $24,500, whatever it was.
$24,500, correct. So I followed up and asked the fiscal officer who was at the meeting directly if he certified the funds, is that would be his signature on that certification. And he couldn't recollect the instance, but did state, if certification was needed, then he was confident that he would do it. So not necessarily a direct answer there, but it was at least touched on at that meeting. And I think it's just a very important question to ask because the law director's reply seemed to give the certification did not take place before or on the date of that contract signature.
All right. So then let's move on. Where do we go from there?
So this legal aspect, Ohio law essentially it exists to kind of stop situations from happening where signatures on contracts are taking place before votes and before money is signed off, essentially. Essentially, it's the Ohio Revised Code. It's 5705.41 Part D. It essentially says you can't spend public money on a contract until the fiscal officer certifies that the money is there. And that has to happen before that contract is signed, not after. That same ordinance does say that any contract made without a certificate shall be void. So like the law director stated at the meeting, the certificate wasn't obtained before signing and the purchase order was, TBD. And the budget wasn't added until December 20th, 2025, which is 87 days after the contract was signed. So that 87 days is important. And I mention it because there is a fix essentially built into the code for instances like this. It's called a then and now certificate, but that fix still requires that certifying the money was available on the signing date. And with the budget line item being added 87 days later, it's kind of hard to say that that was the case on the record. And then, there's a second part to all of this. Yes, the TBD is a concern, but also we have to call into question the signature. Did the township administrator even have documented authority from the board to sign contracts on his own? It's called a delegation resolution. So I've asked to see if this resolution exists. I have not been given an answer on that, but because the board didn't vote yet, is he allowed to sign on their behalf before that vote takes place? My understanding is that if a delegation resolution exists, that has to be part of the public record as well. I've asked for that document, and it's part of the public request that has still not been fulfilled by the city yet. So, I'm interested as well because it's an important concern. It's an important question given the timeline.
Absolutely. All right, now here we are. We're actually adding on an addition to the podcast here because prior to me finishing the edits and getting it out, Nate reached out and said, hey, I've got some more information based on the document requests and the information requests I've submitted. I have had some of those delivered, and I think it's worth talking about and adding some of that context to our discussion here. So Nate, I will turn it over to you. Let us know what you found out.
As of this recording, I'll put out a preface that nothing about this decision itself is final yet, but that window to kind of influence that end decision is getting narrower. The channels for residents to be heard keep getting narrower as well. So getting this information out is ever more important. The first and major thing that I want to touch on from these previous filings was that 3 hours before the Board of Trustees ever sat down to vote on this flock contract, the vendor had already filed paperwork with Cuyahoga County to build 7 cameras in the township. So as we touched on before, on September 25th, the administrator, Gary, he had signed the contract for 8 cameras, totaling $24,500 a year. On October 2nd, notably at 4:30 p.m., an email from Flock went to the permitting rep for Cuyahoga County to submit the right-of-way permit applications for 7 camera locations. 3 hours later at 7:32, the Board of Trustees called their meeting to order and voted on a 4-camera plan for $12,500. Putting it simply, it kind of shows us that our residents in the township never really got a say in any of this. The board went through the motions of a vote, but the decision was already made, and even worse, it was already acted on 3 hours before the board of trustees sat down to discuss that.
Yeah, and interestingly, maybe another lens to look at it too is, did the board itself really even have a say?
Exactly.
At least from an official perspective, it seems like the answer is no. Who knows what conversations are happening, just operationally, right? Not on the record, not as a part of a meeting, where the administrator maybe or maybe not is asking, hey, can I go ahead and sign this? But I could see the case being made, like, if I'm on the board, what's the point of my meeting if it's already been signed and the contract's already going through? I'm an elected official. I should be able to make this decision, and that was robbed of them too.
Right. Yeah. The board did, vote unanimously to pass the smaller version of the contract. But, what's to say that they couldn't have had a disagreement that night, or discussions from the residents, if they'd known about that topic, would have come out and, had a dialogue to stop that vote from taking place. I mean, there are so many avenues where if it didn't go exactly this way, the train was already on the track. It had already left the station at that point. So,
right.
Yeah, a lot of concern about how that was handled.
And then the other question I have, and my mind keeps coming back to the fact that the Board of Trustees only ever authorized by vote in an official meeting the 4-camera $12,500 option.
Right.
So the contract by which Flock, the company, is moving forward with for 7 cameras and more money, is that contract even valid?
And that is the exact question I posed, one, to the trustees, and have not received an answer. And that I've since passed that question along to the auditor's office to see, for numerous reasons, let alone just the timeline of things, but the signature on that contract itself, could the administrator, did he have the authority to sign it in the first place? Yeah, for the administrator to sign a multi-year, almost $25,000 contract without a prior board vote, you expect that the board would have a resolution delegating his authority to do that. It's a, standard document. It's numbered, dated, it's voted on in public. And after 2 separate FOIA requests with the township, they've been, filed and produced, even one with the county as well. Across all of those, every single email, memo, set of minutes, there's no delegation that appears in that record. So I actually followed up directly with Gary, the administrator, and asked him directly about these documents. And his written response was, all relevant documents have been handed over. So if a resolution authorizing a signature existed, I would have assumed it would have been, relevant to the documents requested, especially since I'm asking for it specifically.
Is there more to touch on that authority gap?
Yeah, that basically covered the authority gap. I mean, this was my 4th question in my written comment to the board at the meeting. The previous meetings, the public hearings that we had, and I followed up numerous times. And I think until that question is answered, the community, kind of lost something fundamental. I mean, who has the ability to spend our money, and on whose say so? I think even just beyond the full Flock contract situation, without knowing whose signature means what and who has the authority to do what with our taxpayer money, I think that's a very important question we need answered.
Yeah, I would think so. All right. What else have you found out?
So a couple other things stood out to me. There's 2 places in particular where the township has said something publicly and that didn't match what the public record showed. So the first instance was a memo that Gary had sent to the 3 Board of Trustees on June 8th. It was regarding just updates on the project plans specific to Flock. And in that memo, Gary referenced that the board had, quote, expressed interest in reducing the deployment network for Flock. He mentioned a revised deployment plan consisting of 4 cameras to reduce both the cost and the scope of these cameras. Now, the contradiction of sorts that I see with that is that in every permit record with the county for 8 straight months, is either for 7 or 8 cameras, not 4. And 5 days before that memo was sent to the trustees on June 3rd, Gary told a reporter from the Sun News that he was proceeding with the 8 cameras for $24,000. So I'm not sure where these permitting plans are, or where this documentation is. So I'm just saying that, the paper trail tells one story and the board vote, and this memo tells another. I think, again, we deserve to know which story is the truth in that system. Yeah, I hope the audits from the state will answer those questions on our behalf.
So should we talk about that now, or did you want to talk about some other things first?
There is one other thing that I came across that I think the public will definitely be interested to know, because I was kind of shocked by this. So on the May 20th public hearing meeting, residents brought up a lot of concerns about outside agency access. I shared tons of news articles where this had gone out without proper authority, and even when it had proper authority, it was grossly misused. So some residents at the May 20th meeting asked the police department directly if outside organizations would be allowed to see our data. And we were told that we would not be sharing that information. And after hearing all the ways that data sharing had gone wrong across the country, we felt kind of reassured to hear this. So while we don't have cameras installed, the usage perspective, the account that we have is active and live. The 30 days before my records request was pulled, roughly 90 searches had been run through our township's Flock account, all by outside agencies. Toledo, Fort Wayne, places in North Carolina, state agencies, about 20 different agencies scraped our account for data. So we're already wired into a network of about 1,300 organizations, and just shy of 300 of them are set up to see our system. I'm bringing this up all to say that some cities had even canceled their contract over it, Cleveland being one of the areas where outside agency access was a massive concern, resulting in an eventual cancellation of that contract, and now, revised access extension to that contract. But nevertheless, this matters because, for me at least, I didn't realize our account could still be used even without the cameras. I thought, we were just an output, essentially, so we could only see other things. And because it's already integrated, I looked through, I was able to get a list of all of the agencies that we share with and the ones that we can see. And we're being plugged into, federal agencies, state correction agencies, fusion centers, multi-state intelligence networks. And a quick sidebar on fusion centers, because before looking into this kind of stuff, I wasn't really aware of what they were. So as the name implies, the Fusion Center, it's a fusion of Homeland Security and other federal and state agencies. They are set up to ingest a ton of data and combine that into assessments about individuals to determine if they're a threat. It sounds kind of, good in a way at the surface, but they've also been receiving a lot of pushback due to privacy concerns and overreach concerns. For example, earlier this year, federal agencies and the Joint Terrorism Task Force, which work with the fusion centers, they began producing reports labeling people who are pushing back against AI and data center projects as anti-tech violent extremists. So this is now making it a new domestic threat category. And these centers have been shown to track people who just attend protests, which means our freedom of speech is now, can and now be on a Homeland Security terrorism watch list. So these settings and these searches have already been conducted through our township, and we don't even have cameras yet. So that means by the moment one camera goes up in our township, whatever it captures becomes instantly searchable and integrated into these different organizations.
Wild.
And another thing from the screenshots that I received from the FOIA request, and on their own, settings page, it showed that the two settings were, adjusted for. The first being the reproductive care search was set to enabled. So it's a filter. Essentially, it can't be, if that's toggled to be filtered, no jurisdictions can search for that search criteria type. The other one is immigration related searches. Now that filter is set to disabled, meaning immigration searches can be run through our township. And now I can't speculate on why one is set to one and not the other, but I will say this: at the same May 20th meeting that I talked about earlier, Residents also specifically asked if our cameras would be used to track either reproductive health cases or immigration cases. And we were told that they wouldn't. And, just in the last month alone, the records show that Miami, Florida PD ran an immigration search through our account. So again, public conversation and the actual paperwork and the truth is telling two different stories.
So you're told one thing in a public hearing when citizens are asking about it, but then you go and look at the data, and the data is showing you something completely different. So is the Board of Trustees ignorant to how it's being used, or is the Board of Trustees lying to you?
That's either answer can't necessarily be a good one.
Well, correct. No,
we deserve to know which was which, and if it's a combination, if it's one or the other. I think we need answers to these. We need some accountability from the people that have told us one thing and done another.
All right. So where do things stand right now then?
So like I said, no cameras are in yet. The administrator had told the Sun News on June 3rd that installation was expected to be completed by the end of June. Obviously, June has, came and went, still no cameras. But I've reached out. I've been kind of, calling the county to discuss the permits and seeing any updates on that information, because there's no real online portal to track this kind of stuff. I've been told they're still not finalized. The county, they returned 7 formal deficiencies back in February. Per the last conversation I had, they're still awaiting permit. Now, important to note, the 2 planned locations on, Columbia and Stearns, they were flagged by our engineer, the county's engineer, as potentially outside of the Olmsted Township jurisdiction. So remember, we had touched on that a little bit in previous parts of this episode. So the location discrepancies, they've been due to the fact that it's on that line between the 2 areas. And so those discussions are now taking place to decide, which side of the road it has to be on and where it can face. So those are being currently resolved. As far as authorization, the administrator, his written position to the trustees remains, in his own words, proceeding with installation unless directed otherwise. And from what I've seen from, various emails and memos, no trustee has directed otherwise. So it's still in process, but it's not final yet.
Okay. Can you go into more detail now about what has been filed with state and county authorities and where things go from there?
Sure. Yeah. So 3 different agencies now have a complete record of what we've just kind of discussed. And the board itself has my 4 written questions sitting in front of them. And the first agency being the Auditor of State. So this agency points residents to exactly the kind of concern of how money gets committed when it's, in the public forum. So they're taking the lead on this. I've been told by the Special Investigations Unit from the auditor that that audit is going to be lumped into our overarching audit, so to speak. So the township was due for, I think, of just a general financial audit. So instead of this being an entirely separate investigation, they're going to be looping that into what we were already, having take place. The second agency is the Attorney General's office. So they reviewed my tip, they confirmed it, and they kind of just directed me to the auditor as the appropriate lead because that investigation was already going forward. And then the third was the Cuyahoga County Prosecutor's Office. I essentially gave them a copy for their records to know that this was going on and to follow up if anything was needed from the auditor's office. They confirmed that everything was set in motion there as well. Lastly, like I said, the Board of Trustees does have my written comment on multiple counts, both in the record from the June 18th meeting and from subsequent emails back and forth with them. So for context, those 4 questions are, was the fiscal certification obtained before the contract was signed? 2, did the board authorize the 8-camera scope? 3, will the board pause installation of these cameras pending the oversight review? And lastly, did the administrator have documented delegated authority before that contract was signed as of, September 25th? And as of this recording, there's still no answers to these. So
do you have a sense of the timeline of those answers?
Yeah, none at all. I've brought it up at every point that I could. I think I've brought it up to them on 3 separate occasions now, and they've taken every opportunity to kind of ignore that. So they essentially point to the record and they refuse to answer the questions. Now, I'm not, none of this means I've accusing them of any wrongdoing. It just means that I want these questions answered. And those questions are now being brought to the agencies whose job it is to review them and make sure they're answered.
Yeah. And I think that is, especially hearing some of these details, I think that's more important than ever. I want to acknowledge something here, and it's that regardless of what you might think about Flock, you, in my opinion, should be concerned to know that this is how business is being conducted in your local government. There are gaps on how and what authority people have to do certain things without the vote of the trustees. Things have been done out of order and potentially illegally to put a contract through to fruition where your tax dollars are being spent. I think that regardless, again, of where you stand on this particular technology being used, these are some questions that are well worth being answered.
100%. And that brings us right into what can our community still do? What can we do to get these questions answered? And my answer to that is show up and write in. Those are really the two main levers that we still have. And the second one is arguably more important now that the board is refusing to hear any comment that's not on the written agenda. So I've got my list of 4 options, so to speak, varying levels of effort and time. But option number 1 is just submit a written comment to the record. So this is something that I've done multiple times now. Public comment at meetings is now limited to the agenda items, but a written comment emailed to the township before that meeting starts, so to speak, is the official record. It has to be added in. Doesn't need to be long. It can be a couple sentences. It can even just be the 4 questions that I posed to you guys today, but it is a permanent entry and they can't ignore that. So that's option 1. Option 2 is, if possible, show up to the township meetings. It's in the community room, 7900 Fitch Road. They do have Zoom options if you want to tune in remotely and just, leave a comment in the chat. But attendance in and of itself is a signal. It shows that we care. We want to, be a part of these conversations. It shows intent. And these comments, again, can be submitted to the record in writing at these meetings as well. They have forms there to fill out. Option number 3, because it's not on the agenda, we can't have that dialogue at these public hearings. So ask the trustees to put it on the agenda. Residents can email in and ask the trustees to put it on an upcoming agenda. So this request itself, even if they don't grant it, does also become part of the public record and does show, hey, a lot of residents are asking for this. This request was, ignored X amount of times. That has its own weight. And lastly, and I think this is extremely important, is tell a neighbor. Most residents don't really know that this is happening, and that's not necessarily their fault. It wasn't communicated very well by the township, by the board. Neighbor-to-neighbor conversations are really what can change in terms of applying pressure to our governance. And not one person shouting over another. It's just talking about it, discussing what you think should have happened, what you would like to see in terms of 1, accountability, and 2, how our township and community should be run. This is a community by the people. We should have a say in how things are happening, especially with our tax dollars. That's the most important. So like I said, have the conversations with your neighbor, whether that be in person, online. Don't stop talking about it. This is something that we should continue to press until we get the answers that we deserve. So speak up. That's our power.
All right, Nate, is there anything else that you want to express here?
I feel there's been so many questions just piling up, and we've been at a loss in terms of what the township has said about it. At the May meeting, May 20th, we tried to have that conversation with the board, and one resident even said directly, asked if our opinion mattered on the subject of this contract and for mass surveillance as a whole. And the board quite literally said, and I'll quote, "No, our opinion did not matter," which was concerning and troubling, especially as we've elected them to act on our behalf and review our concerns and opinions and preferences as a community. So yeah, I think that just about covers it. I appreciate your willingness to have this extra conversation on top of our previous one, and I think it's this is getting more important by the day.
All right, Nate, thank you again. I will talk to you later.
All right, sounds good, Mark.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Olmsted Overheard. I want to give a real big thank you to Nate French for the amount of work that has gone into this. Filing records requests, cross-referencing contracts and meeting minutes, following up with the state auditor's office and the attorney general. Whatever you land on with Flock as a technology, this kind of legwork and care about his community deserves credit. If you want to weigh in on this issue in an official capacity while it is still an open item, Nate laid out a few ways to do it. Submit a written comment to the township, show up to a Board of Trustees meeting, join by Zoom, reach out to the trustees to put this topic on future agendas, or just talk to your neighbors and have conversations about this. As always, if there is a story or a topic that you think this show should dig into, or if you want to help me with the production of this podcast, don't hesitate to reach out. My name is Mark McCausland, and this has been Olmsted Overheard.